Hello, everybody. Again, I'm Dr. David Ansardi, and I want to welcome you to Chapter 16, where we will be covering the endocrine system. And in this course, I am dividing the endocrine content into two parts. So one part will be the endocrine anatomy part, where you will study the various endocrine glands in the body that produce hormones, and even getting down to the level of specific regions of particular endocrine glands that may produce different hormones. So that'll be covered over in the endocrine anatomy section. In this series of lectures, I'm going to cover the function of the endocrine system. And I think you'll find the endocrine system very interesting because the endocrine system plays huge roles in controlling physiological processes. All right, so moving forward here. Okay, so again, let's kind of, some of this, if you've already started the endocrine anatomy portion of the class, you will have already heard some of this already. But let's just kind of introduce the endocrine system here. Now, this is a diagram over here from your textbook, which of course has giving you an overview of the major endocrine glands of the body, so I'm not going to rehash that here. You will need to know these different endocrine glands and the regions of the endocrine glands that are required. Those are listed on the study guide for the endocrine anatomy part of the course. But what is a hormone? Now, surely in Biology 201 you talked about hormones just a little bit from time to time. And hormones are chemical molecules. They are chemical messengers that are produced by endocrine glands. Or in some cases, there are just little groups of cells or particular subtypes in other organs of the body that will produce hormones as well. And these hormones enter the bloodstream, so they're secreted by these glands. They're released from the cells that make them. They get into the bloodstream and they travel throughout the body. Now, when you studied control back in Biology 201, when you were learning about the nervous system, you learned that the nervous system tends to control things locally, like one neuron controlling another neuron, or a neuron sending a signal to a skeletal muscle fiber to try to stimulate it to contract. Hormones, on the other hand, are produced at higher levels and they travel throughout the body in the bloodstream, and so they can have effects across the entire body. Now, as we'll see, hormones bind to specific receptors. Those receptors are located on what we call target cells. So a hormone is made by an endocrine gland, gets into the bloodstream, it can exit the blood and enter the interstitial tissue fluids throughout the body. And if a cell has a receptor molecule that hormone can attach to, then the cell will respond to the hormone. If not, the cell may have no response to the hormone. So these hormones can go everywhere in the body, but they're going to act on particular cells that we call the target cells. All right, what does an endocrine gland typically look like? So in Biology 201, you may have talked about the differences between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Maybe you remember that term. Exocrine glands are things like your salivary glands, your sweat glands in the skin that secrete substances toward the outside of the body, and those glands have ducts. Endocrine glands do not have ducts. A duct is a tube, kind of like an air duct in your house. So endocrine glands, though, don't have ducts. So a typical endocrine gland more or less looks like this. So you have within the gland cells, like you see here. Those cells are responsible for producing the hormone or hormones made by that gland. Those hormones then are secreted into the surrounding fluids, those interstitial extracellular fluids, and they're very quickly taken up by little teeny tiny microscopic blood vessels called capillaries that are located within those glands. So an endocrine gland is going to have a lot of small capillaries extending through it. Capillaries contain blood. The capillaries will pick up those hormones and carry them off further into the bloodstream, into bigger blood vessels, and then from there those hormones will travel to the rest of the body. All right, so again, a little bit of difference. I talked about this just a minute ago as from an introductory level, but let's think about the difference between neural control and hormonal control. So neural control referring to your nervous system. So you guys learned, hopefully, in Biology 201, AMP1, that neurons are the main cell type of your nervous system, and they communicate by generating action potentials. Those are changes in voltage, ion concentrations, charge across their cell membranes that occur very rapidly. Those action potentials trigger those neurons to secrete chemicals that we call neurotransmitters. So things like the acetylcholine that you studied when you learned about how neurons stimulate skeletal muscle fibers to contract. So those neurotransmitters, as I mentioned earlier, they act locally. So they kind of stay in a localized area, and they're generally broken down really quickly after that. So they have very short-term effects usually, and their effects are very rapid, often almost instantaneous. Now, on the other hand, your endocrine glands that make these chemical hormones that go everywhere in the body, it takes a while for them to be produced. So they're a little bit slower on production. They travel throughout the body, so it's going to take longer for their effects to occur. They act on target cells with receptors, as we already mentioned, and their effects can be longer lasting. So whereas a motor neuron might stimulate a skeletal muscle fiber to contract for some fraction of a second, once hormones are made, the effects of hormones can last for minutes or hours or even days in some cases. All right, and as we will see, so we will talk about, now here in Chapter 16, we're getting an overview of the endocrine system to start off the course. However, we will talk about hormones throughout the rest of the course. There are hormones involved in controlling all of your body systems. So as we'll see, hormones are very much involved in controlling the reproductive system. Now, reproductive hormones we will mention here in Chapter 16, but we will really learn about them in detail at the end of the course when we cover the reproductive system. They're very involved in growth of the human body, proper development of the human body, maintaining your water balance, your electrolyte levels, controlling the levels of nutrients like glucose. Electrolytes are things like sodium and potassium and calcium. Those are charged ions that are floating around in your body fluids, and hopefully you recall from Biology 201 that many of those electrolytes or ions are very, very important for various bodily functions. And we have to maintain them in proper homeostatic ranges, if you remember that. So hormones are also going to be involved in controlling your metabolism. And you can probably think of the endocrine gland that's intimately involved in that, the thyroid, because a lot of times when people have problems with their metabolism, they mention having thyroid problems. So metabolism, energy balance, how efficiently you use the calories in your food for energy purposes. And even your body defenses, the function of your immune system is dependent on various hormones as well. And those are just some examples. Hormones tend to control many, 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 many things in the body. I do want to point out a couple of other terms. So in Chapter 16, we will primarily be discussing the endocrine hormones, these chemical messengers that get into the blood and travel throughout the entire body and may impact target cells way, way, way away from where they're initially made. But there are a couple of other terms that do come up when we're learning about the function of the human body. We have autocrines and paracrines. Now what these two have in common is they act locally. So they're produced by cells, not necessarily a particular gland, but maybe just individual cells. They're secreted outside of those cells, and they stay in a local area. They act in a local area, so they're not going to get in the blood and travel way off elsewhere in the body and cause changes or responses far away from where they're made. Okay, now similar to hormones, they are chemical messengers. But the key thing that differs is that they act locally. So this word autocrine, now auto, you guys probably already know, means cell in biology when we see auto. So autocrines act on the same cell that secreted them, which is kind of weird to think about, but Drag my face away from my diagram over here. So you can see over here, this diagram, here's a cell, and this little yellow stop sign here is supposed to be a chemical messenger that that cell secretes. And then that chemical messenger turns around and binds to this little green molecule there in the cell membrane. Is supposed to be a receptor that very specifically attaches to that chemical messenger, and then the cell will respond itself. So that probably seems kind of strange. Like, why would a cell have to secrete a chemical messenger that's going to turn around and attach to its own receptor and cause a response? But nevertheless, it does happen in some cases. So that's called autocrine signaling when that does occur. Paracrines, on the other hand, para, you can generally think about that as meaning next to in biology. So paracrines are chemical messengers that are secreted, like we see here, and they float over, diffuse over to nearby cells attached to receptors on those cells and stimulate some sort of change. And of course, up here on the top part of the diagram, we are seeing an example of what endocrine hormones do. They actually get into the bloodstream. The blood carries them to some distant part of the body, or not necessarily a distant part of the body, but the bloodstream, if something gets in the blood, it's going to essentially travel everywhere in the body and can act on target cells that are a long way off. Okay, so that was just a little introduction to the endocrine system and some of this concept, some of these basic concepts of chemical messaging. In the next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about the different chemical classes of hormones and how they're grouped according to their chemical structures. So that'll be the topic for our second lecture for Chapter 16.